Hi, and welcome to writehive 2026. For those of you that this is your first panel, hello. For those of you who it's not, welcome back to yet another panel in our conference. I don't know what time this is going to be within the conference itself, so you can pretend that I gave you the right answer, whichever one it was. This is the political writing panel, what to know about political writing. And I am your host for this panel, S. Morgan Burbank. My pronouns are they, them, she, and my very existence may well be considered to be political. But to anyone who says that, please refer to my guillotine earrings at this time. With me today, I have three guests who I will let to introduce themselves at this time because it is a little easier for them to do that anyway. I will begin with Livia J. Elliot.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. I'm Livia J. Elliot. I'm an author. I'm also a podcaster. I have a Substack, and I also write interactive fiction. So one of my main focus is always political settings. So I'm very delighted to be here. Thank you.
All right. And also with us for this panel is Jesse Pohlman. Jesse.
Well, hello there and good day. Thank you for having me. My name is Jesse Pohlman, and I've dabbled in both genre fiction and real life reporting in a couple of ways. For a day job, I spent 8 years in the education world as a teaching assistant, as a social studies teacher, and as an ELA teacher. In the journalistic one, I spent 5 years and change doing hyperlocal journalism in my hometown of Freeport, New York, with the Weekly Freeporter, and I maintain an op-ed project called the Progressive Cafe on Beehive. Most recently, as in May 2026, I published a fantasy novel called Locker's Rebellion, where an arcane scientist and her swordswoman wife are recruited on a mission to protect their kingdom from an insurrection that would, among other things, see fit to take rights away from people like them. You can find out more on my website, www.jpohlmanwriting.com, and link up with me on my social media over at Blue Sky, which I'm at, the little at in a circle, jpohlmanwriting.com. Last thing about me, if you see me looking down and away from the camera, it's because I'm making little notes, unless my cat Ophelia comes upstairs and sits on my lap.
So what I will say for anyone who's watching this live, there is a cat tax. So if a cat shows up and we show it to you, feel free to celebrate because, well, cats. Lastly, we have Ian Patterson. I'll let Ian introduce himself.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm Ian Patterson, an award-winning author of science fiction, horror, and poetry. I wrote The Narrator Cycle, which won the Colorado Book Award, and my forthcoming release, Fruits of Our Labor, is hyper-political and near-future America.
Awesome. Lovely to have you here. Let's go ahead and get started. And our first question kind of is a bit of a broad question in terms of how politics and art overlap. There's this statement, this idea that all art is political. In hearing that statement, how do you feel about that? What is your response to that sentiment?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. Underlying every story that you could write is kind of a governing philosophy. And it may not be super consistent or interesting or profound, but that philosophy is directionally tied to politics and pretty impossible to remove unless you somehow tell a story that's like devoid of morality or ethics entirely, which I think just would not be super interesting. So I think yes, it's pretty impossible to remove from stories.
I do agree that all books are political and all art in general. However, I do think that characteristic is presented in a different way or at a different degree, right? And whether someone perceives a piece of art or a book as political, that's a completely different question. And why I think this is because we are political beings. We are born into societies. Societies have organizations, right? And their structures, their problems, everything affect us. So that biases us, and that bias is communicated into the writing, right? Or in this case, or any other type of writing. I think that sometimes when people get annoyed about saying like books shouldn't be political, it's more about that they are not in alignment with the biases of the author that is appearing in that book, right? And that misalignment makes the political aspect of a book, of a commentary or whatever, more obvious to the reader, right? I think that even if we try very hard, I don't think we can make something entirely apolitical.
Jesse, do you have any follow-up thoughts on that?
We are political beings is a great thing to say. When I think about art, I think the circumstances in which it was created is really important. I've taken to calling this the trap of origination, but it probably has another name. I don't know because I'm human. I have one life to live and learn with, and I just haven't learned the term for that yet. I think of the original circumstances that art was made. Is it a resource-rich place like the Renaissance or the modern day? Was it a resource-poor place where the materials are scarce, hard to come by, and personally costly? Ancient cave paintings are history because they tell us how our ancestors lived, and political because they told us about their lives and what they did. Last year at writehive, I learned from Sean Morrissey Carroll about bone music, where Soviet dissidents would take X-rays that were used to take pictures of people's bones and convert them to short-lived records to hear otherwise forbidden music. That's political for a whole bundle of reasons, because even if the art itself were to be considered relatively bland and inoffensive, it still got banned for some reason, and thus listening to it is transgressive and political.
I think that's a fascinating item to touch on, and I think it relates to something that Livia brought up that I'd like to circle back to real quick. That being, Livia, you brought up this whole idea of apolitical writing versus political writing. And I have in my time, just be it as an author, be it on social media, whatever, ran into quite a few folks who say that their art, whatever their art is apolitical by nature. If you hear that from someone, regardless of what their art is, how do you respond to that?
I think I will answer with a bit of disbelief. Not long ago, I'm not sure if you're aware, Andy Weir, the author of Project Hail Mary, he did an interview, and in the interview, he said that the responsibility of authors is to entertain, and thus he tries to keep all of a political commentary out of his book, right? Or his art in general. I don't quite agree with that. As I said, I think that one element, let me backtrack. One point about being biased is that we don't choose to be biased. Bias is inherent to us, and we just are. We can become conscious that we are being biased, right? But it's not like we actively choose to be so or don't. So in the same way, because society gives us one perspective, it biases us and it doesn't let us choose. That author may truly think that they are doing something entirely apolitical, but I'm quite sure that if somebody else read their book, they will find some commentary in there, simply because it's written in a way that the author, it's so transparent to the author themselves, right? That it doesn't get, it's not visible to them. I don't think we can extrapolate ourselves from the society that we live in, or from the context that we live in, from the experiences that we have. And all of that ends up being part of what we write, right? If somebody faces oppression in one way or another, if somebody faces poverty, probably they are going to write it in a way that somebody who went through the same will be able to pick it up, you know? So to circle back to answer to your question, my answer will be with a bit of disbelief. It's okay for them to believe that, but I don't think it is possible.
Jesse, do you have commentary on the same question?
Oh, absolutely. And I agree with everything Livia said. For me, it's I would shoot them a very skeptical side eye and wonder aloud how they think they can separate themselves out of the work. I mean, Livia just gave a perfect explanation of this trap of origination theme that I came to when I was coming up with my answers to these questions today. Because even a child's drawing represents politics. Is it made with a fine crayon or smeared mud? Is it hung up on a refrigerator, or is there no refrigerator because they don't have the technology to do that there in this place, either because they live in a time before that or they live in a place where we haven't yet seen fit to help them get that technology for some reason. If such simple creations cannot escape that trap, then how would a book with characters, conflicts, themes, and plots and all that jazz escape the trap? How would a fine painting by a Renaissance expert escape politics if they had to obtain patronage by the upper crust, who of course had their own interest in commissioning the art in the first place? I think a lot of times these people assume they're being reasonable people and all that, so they don't have to get political to have a good story with clear themes, ignoring the fact that just about any theme they embrace is going to have a political message behind it.
I think that trying to intentionally create art that strives to be apolitical is in itself a political assertion. So you are commenting that you want to remove the political discussion from that art. Normally, when I see this in the wild, it's because those people's politics are less favorable in the space that they're trying to be active in. And so it's normally a bit of a red flag for me personally.
I like framing it as seeing them in the wild, as if you just walk up on the street and somebody tells you, "Hello, I have no politics."
Yeah,
Here's my art to prove it.
they clearly do have politics, and trying to remove those is trying to exist in a space without talking about them.
That's totally fair. And I try not to answer these questions too much myself as a moderator. It's not my job. Panels for you all for obvious reasons. But I think one thing that what you guys said just maybe want to ask about is that there was very much a time when I was a newbie author where I would write X story, whatever I was writing at the time. And even though I knew inherently creating art has a level of politics to it, it was hard at times for me to really want to take like an active, loud, overt stand in my writing. Now, that has obviously changed over time. But what I would like to ask to you all is, let's say that there is somebody in this audience today who is a newer author. They are struggling with this idea of, I want to be able to infuse political writing more into my writing, whether it be overtly, subtly, whatever it may be. Why is the idea of taking a stand in your writing important, and what value does it provide beyond the obvious showing what your opinions, what your beliefs are?
Yeah, I think it's central. I've said on other some of the other panels that I've been on that I see myself as a writer from theme. So I think theme is a central element in a story that most elements should be derived from and in conversation with. And so from a story structure alone, I think having those core beliefs not only be consistent and visible, um, it really helps the story resonate and stay memorable through time. But then also, I mean, we live in this world that seems increasingly constructed against human existence, and art is a tool of active resistance against that. So to me personally, I think it's super important to take a stand and to use art to do that. Books especially have a mode of creating widespread cultural upheaval. And so that's what I try to do with my art. Um, Obviously, everyone has different goals with the art that they're creating. But for me, art is very much a form of protest.
Yeah, it's a complex question. And I will answer a bit more subjectively from the point of view of what I like to read as well, right? I'm biased in that case. So I personally think that it's okay to have books that are for entertainment, right? Or books that are a bit more lightweight, I will say. And that's okay. We all want sometimes something to read that is easy and that is followable. However, I do think that the books that we keep remembering are the books that are deeply thematic, the books that the authors try to make a stance. For example, Like It or Not, 1984. Everybody knows that book, at least by name, and that's because it made a stance, right? It took a risk. It took a risk and tried to complain. Orwell was writing from what he knew. He was a propagandist, a big part of that book is about propaganda and how that affects people and how the government can use it to control people, right? So he was taking a stance, and that's why we remember it. Probably the Strugatsky brothers, Russian authors, one of my favorite books of them is Snail on the Slope. They wrote very weird things just to move around the censors, right? And they are sci-fi masterworks and classics because of the messages that they put up, right? I'm not saying that if you write thematic, then you are going to be remembered for the ages. If you write something simpler, then you are going to be forgotten, right? But we tend to go back always to the books that impact us. And I think that's mostly because of the themes, at least for me, because I'm mostly a thematic reader, right? So to me, it's also a matter of not only that, but also what an author is comfortable doing, right? An author may not be comfortable going or being incredibly overt. You can use metaphors, right? Or allegories or literalized metaphors. That's a very useful idea. For example, the book I mentioned before, Snail on the Slope, it has a whole setting of, it's a dual setting, the administration versus the forest. You can read the relationship between both in 100 political ways. And it's very interesting, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to be literal. You can also take that different stance of going through a metaphor. Yes, that means that there may be people who won't pick it up, right? But that also means that people who really needs to hear it out may not have the shock of having to read the idea and be slowly eased into it through the metaphor, right? And what I mean by that is that sometimes when we are writing things that are a bit more social or more political, you always have roughly three groups of people: people who are completely in alignment with the author, people who are completely opposite, and people in between, right? And probably the author, the people that wants them to be read the most, is those that are opposite to them, those who truly disagree. A metaphor can help you reach them out more easily, because instead of going into a clash, you are trying to ease them into a story, and the moment they are already hooked is a moment when the metaphor clicks in, right? So I think, to me, it really depends on what you want to achieve and what the author is comfortable doing, right?
It makes complete sense. Jesse, any thoughts from you on this?
So I love the idea to start with that, like we have our lightweight things that we like to read, because even those tend to have themes. I like Mercedes Lackey's Valdemar novels, and they're relatively lightweight, very, very hope core, but also like they do have themes of darker stuff, and like, hey, fighting against that darker stuff is important, right? So if we're running with this mantra that all art is political, then the themes we put in our stories and the people we represent within them matters substantially, right? The artist and the art are rarely that far separated, even if people sometimes want to pretend that they're just there to entertain. I find that hard to believe. Um, a lot of my writing, for example, includes themes of queer liberation. Small wonder, I'm bi, I'm pan, so I'm writing about queer people asserting their own rights to exist. The trickier part is when you have to represent somebody who isn't like we are. And while I tend to write fiction in fantastical settings, a lot of that stuff still ties back to real world phenomenon. Even when we create a whole fictional world, there's still phenomenon that are based on our experiences in our world, because we lived them. That's what brought us up. So even if I try to deliberately say this real world phenomenon isn't as prevalent in my fantasy world where there's sorcery and airships, it's still informed by those real world things existing in a way I'm deliberately trying to minimize for the sake of highlighting other parts of my story. And sometimes, if you were talking about advice for new writers, try not to do a disservice to those people when you do that. Try to accurately represent people. And we'll talk more about that in another question, I'm sure. But like, also focus on the writing, focus on getting the themes down, and that's where you're going to find your success.
That's fair. That makes total sense. I think it was interesting, Livia, you brought up 1984, and I write dystopia, and 1984 was like, people ask me what got me into writing. That's a top 3 book, because Not
It's one of
necessarily
my faves.
yeah, not necessarily explicitly just because I like it, and I do, to be clear, but because it isn't afraid to be very clear about exactly what its messages and messaging are within the story. And I appreciate that greatly. And I suppose that leads into the next question I have, and that is, I just talked about one of my influences, that being 1984. There's many others that have influenced me over time. I want to know what some of your influences are. How do you choose to incorporate politics in your stories? Is it explicitly just through your own experience? Is it a result of the books that you grew up loving? What's your all's thoughts there?
Yeah, that's okay. So I think that my most political series is this one, Records of the Orders. In The Omens of War, in particular, the two main POVs are strategists. Some of the themes that I like the most are geopolitics in general, like the conditions for war, what leads a society to war, how you can create a Nash equilibrium and stall peace at the cost of bringing in stagnation. So those are the themes that I really like. I think that one of the influences in that regard is Dune, the book, not the movies. The movies are a bit washed out. The book is incredibly political. I have a very in-depth analysis of that in my podcast if you are interested. But the way it has, actual tensions between the different parties, the different characters thinking how they can acquire authority and what they have to do to legitimize that authority, right? The identity at a level of a society, for example, how it tackles the Fremen, those are the themes that I like the most. To me, in that series in particular, a recurrent theme is that identity, it's not only at an individual level, it also exists as a societal level, right? So how can a politician manipulate that? And so my characters, of course, 1984, Animal Farm, Fahrenheit, those are also big influences for me. I really love that type of commentary, but I generally try to focus on, the overview, so on nations and on countries rather than on people or specific issues, right? Mostly because I find the interaction between nations very interesting. Something that actually influenced that series is real life figures. So I read a lot of nonfiction. I read a lot of nonfiction also regarding the First World War, the period between wars, Second World War, and the Cold War. One of the characters, a woman, she's a strategist. She's based on Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany. It's not a copy. So basically what I tried to do was like, how did he think? How did he negotiate, right? Why did he did a specific, for example, the Treaty of Vienna? What were his motivations? And so that's what I tried to reproduce in there. So it's not precisely the same, of course. It's just like trying to understand the principles of realpolitik and applying them through this character, right? And for the other character, I used Marcus Aurelius because I love Stoicism. I love the whole idea. So that's how I came up with the setting. I have generally I derive a lot of pleasure from creating those nations and seeing them like, okay, if I want to cause this conflict, how do I have to structure them, right? And of course, it has some fantasy elements. It has cosmic horror, eldritch horror elements that series. So there is another layer of complexity in there. But that's what I like to write. And I know that some people will say like, it's more political intrigue, right? And I'm quite sure that if you can see the parallelisms between a specific events in history, like the Treaty of Vienna and others that are happening in that book, and also my books end up, at least those that are very political, end up always coming back to the idea of how do you legitimize authority and how a politician or a leader can use fear and desire as a way to control the population or to direct them, right? So that's generally what I choose to write. And I think it's also more that overview that I got from the books that I loved, right?
Like I said, I see myself as a writer from theme. And so when I start to write a story, it's to talk about something in particular. So every element is really going to be structured around that, the characters, the plot, um, some of the descriptions, all of that sort of stuff. I think there is a chance of being too didactic when you do this. Um, and there's a fine line that I tread on where you cross over the suspension of disbelief, and it's clear to the reader that you're just beating them upside the head with like propaganda. And it's all propaganda, of course, like positive, negative, whatever you want to call it. But you want to maintain that level of, the suspension of disbelief so that the reader can come along for the journey and not just feel like they're being lectured at. Um, and maybe to like point out an example that I think didn't do it really well. uh, and I always kind of use this like, hopefully I'm not doing the same thing that she did. Uh, Writers like Ayn Rand, who used all of their writing to argue for, their politics, their philosophy. And I find her politics pretty abhorrent. But you can take like a single descriptive paragraph out of Atlas Shrugged and find the same overarching message as the entire book in that one paragraph. And on one hand, that's like pretty cool and really consistent, but it's also just awful to read and really annoying. So there's a bar that you can cross over where it's just really not great for reading anymore.
So I love to talk about the process of it all, right? Because throughout my writing career, I've incorporated politics in a lot of ways. Much of it learned firsthand from the minutia of going to village board meetings and school board meetings and all these different meetings to learn the grand strategy of national elections as well. And it ties into this question of whether something is genuinely political or deemed as political because of whose stories it tells. There's a saying that all politics is personal, which when I was planning my answers out for this, I learned is apparently a Joe Biden quote. I think it's pretty basic. Our personal experiences get into our writing, and we fall into that trap of origination. I can say this correctly. That I've been yapping about thus far. So all of the stuff that we've learned throughout our lives goes into what we are, who we are, and into our work. And having seen politics up close, like Livy's talking about the Treaty of Vienna, that had a lot of politics involved in dealing with nations, but also the intricacies of who's going to agree to what points when and how. So, as to something out of my work, there's a scene in Locker's Rebellion, which, just recently came out, where the antagonist goes to what's basically a city council meeting, and he has to sweat as the votes come in as to whether or not the community will join his rebellion. It's vote counting, which is usually one of the most boring things in politics, but paradoxically, sometimes one of the most tense. It's the various counselors who get up and state their opinion and their vote and make arguments for and against why they should be joined up with. It's like John McCain going on the Senate floor and thumbs downing the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, or Kirsten Sinema doing the same thing to a federal minimum wage increase. There's a factor of personality at play as someone does or doesn't make a charismatic, convincing argument, but there's also the helplessness that those depending on the vote feel, and the fact that our antagonist's faith means he hardly harbors any doubts at all. That's a separate topic.
So I'm curious about something. And this isn't one of the questions I sent out before, but Livia and Jesse, you both said something that lead me to wonder something. Are all political writers, dystopia writers, sci-fi writers, just secretly history nerds in disguise? Because I know that applies to me.
I'm not sure. What I can tell you is that the other day I went to a secondhand bookstore and I found an Hannah Arendt book, and I just went on a happy spree, which is The Origin of Totalitarianism, that book. But yeah, I think it depends, honestly, what you are trying to write and what you are going to comment. I do think that at least you have been bothered by the topic that you are going to write about in your life at one point. Otherwise, I think that the bug and the need to write about that wouldn't come in. At least that's for me how I write. Like, I wrote a whole book with the nation has a very fictional political government that is based on how academia works, because I wanted to complain about academia, right? So I generally write because I get the theme first. So I want to complain about something, or I want to just share an idea, or I want to just evaluate an idea, and I think that the books are a good idea to do it, not necessarily to complain. This one, The Echoes of Yore, is not that political, it's more psychological horror, right? Even if it is part of the same series, it's a genre blender. So I think it depends on that. But at the same time, to go back to your question, Morgan, to me, it's more like if you are writing political or something, at least you have been annoyed by something, right? That made you want to comment.
I mean, yeah, I'm definitely a history nerd. My first bachelor's degree was in history. My first teaching certification was in history. And yeah, I mean, I got an English degree after that to be a better writer, but I also took creative writing classes during my first degree, and it was fine. You know, I think you have to have a grasp on history, not necessarily an academically provided one. You can learn history through, reading books on your own accord, as long as you discipline yourself to be open to new ideas. You can learn history from YouTube. I'm going to be talking later about a history channel called Historia Civilis that does all sorts of history. And, you know, yeah, I think if you're going to write politics, you need to have a basis of how political systems work, and our political systems are rooted in history. So you're going to need that. Otherwise, what are you writing? Because if you don't understand how political systems have historically worked, and you just try to come up with something on the fly, you're going to end up with a mishmash that doesn't make sense. And trust me, my first book, I wrote it while I was in college. It does not hold up as well as my more recent work. I can tell you that. And that's because I didn't have as full of an understanding as I do now about how things really work. It was much more idealized and much more just hand wavy, and this will work just fine. And like, no, not really. It doesn't. And there's a million reasons why. I just hadn't been exposed to them yet, because again, I am one human with one lifetime to learn. I mean, I believe in reincarnation. That's another story.
Can I follow up on something that he said?
Please
Because, yeah, I think that there was a golden point in there. That is that if you are going to write about political systems, you have to understand how political system works, right? And that's not only to make it compelling, but also because you can create plot holes. If you want to write a book that is about political intrigue and you have no idea about how nations work, right? What are the conditions for war? And you are trying to have a setting in which, yeah, there is going to be a war. Like, it's not going to have any foundation, right? It's going to have plot holes. And if somebody with a bit of knowledge picks it up, it's going to be like, yeah, that's not how it works, So I'm not saying like go completely nerd and review everything, but at least if that's the route that you want to take, you have to know a bit about the geopolitics as well. I think it's a great point what Jesse said. Yeah,
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Probably on some level, because I think to really talk about the way the world is, you need to understand the way that it has been in the past and the way that it could be in the future, especially when you're writing, sci-fi dystopia stories. I would say I'm a medium history nerd. I'm certainly not the most knowledgeable about history. I'm an engineer, so like the number of history courses I had to take was pretty slim. But I think it's very important, especially to know the wide breadth of things that has happened, tragedies that have happened, economic upheaval, all of that sort of stuff plays into our understanding and shaping of the world.
Is there not history, and this is off topic that, we may or may not keep it in the end recording. Is there not, from an engineering standpoint, though, an inherent knowledge of history that's required? For example, you look at environmental engineering and learning how to build structures better in hurricane-prone areas so as not to have those homes, businesses, whatever, destroyed, flooded as easily. Is that not also a way of looking back at history?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's pretty hard to separate even from that. When I went to school to be an engineer, it was to try and find a way to like incorporate alternative energies to work on that and like work for a better future. So, I mean, even in that choice is politics, is history, is all of that.
Really fair. I guess my next question kind of falls into the same general premise. Why is it, do you think, that some stories that, even if they're not like inherently overtly directly political, why are some stories viewed as more political than others, especially in the sense that a story that may not look to be as political on the surface can oftentimes be viewed as more political than one that is intently, directly, overtly political?
I think there's probably multiple reasons why. I think certainly stories that are more intent and overt, it's easier to pick up on those themes as them being political. But also the moment in time that they're released in, they can be hyper political stories that then, in hindsight don't seem as political as they did in the moment.
Mhm.
Um, to me, though, when a story stands out as being political, what I'm looking for is a certain intellectual consistency in its themes and message. So it is expressly trying to say a specific thing um, through the story.
To me, that's because of the interaction between the author's intention and the reader's perception, right? So, as humans, we sometimes are touchy about some ideas or some topics in general, right? And if you read something that you are touchy about, right, like a theme that you are not precisely agreeing with or happy to discuss, right? That may come to be a bit more obvious and it can be a bit more touchy. However, I do think that if at least this is my personal preference, right? I'm not saying that this is right or wrong, but if you're going for the route of a metaphor, it has to be a metaphor. It doesn't have to be, a halfway thing in which you end up pointing and clarifying every step of a metaphor because that ends up being annoying. And that's a point where sometimes it gets criticized, right? And I think at the end of the day, there is also some people that will complain because if the topic hits closer to home, they are going to feel lectured or put down or, that type of comment. Or it may be the opposite. The metaphor is very subtle, but they truly understand the topic because they have lived through it. They may have lived through the same political situation, so they see themselves reflected through it, right? So I think that, again, with 1984, I think that a lot of people in modern times can point at that book and say, like, yes, it happened, but that's also because of the lived experiences, right? So there may be a spectrum in there as to why people react differently. At the end of the day, as a writer, I think we need to learn to let go of how we want readers to react, right? Especially when you are writing political, there is a higher chance that it will be a very polarizing book. People will hate it and people will love it. All of these books that we have mentioned, like 1984 or Fahrenheit, uh, the Strugatsky brothers that I mentioned, go to Goodreads, read them and read the reviews, and you will see that people either put the book in a pedestal or other people that want to burn it, that think it's the worst book ever, right? And I think it's those polarizing opinions are just the nature of this type of writing that you have, right? And yeah, to run back on the answer, it's to me it's mostly because of how close to home the topic may be to the person in question, right? And to the implementation of the author or what they did in the book in particular.
I really love the saying "let go of reader reaction." I put little stars around it on my notepad, which you can see it's filling out quickly. So, this question, maybe it's just because I'm internet poisoned and I'm just seeing lens through the lens of like someone who's been just corrupted by internet dialogue and discourse. But the way I see it, this is really asking two separate questions at once, and for some reason, it's easy for me to understand, but it's really hard for me to unpack. There's this genuine question about what political stories are, and then there's this false-faced question raised when any type of representative stories are told that don't toe conventional lines. It's the difference between having a story about how political structures work or don't work to take care of the people versus having a story be deemed political just because it's got a black protagonist. The authentic question is absolutely worth exploring because whenever you're writing characters in proximity to power, you're touching on the political. The disingenuous question is the distraction bigots try to get people to fall for, so they don't explore how those powers are impacting their lives. And that isn't to say that the two don't have some legitimate overlap. I write a lot of queer people in my literature, and their struggles for acceptance are very much political in a way that some people might not be comfortable with. But it's that much harder for those of us in the community because those are our lived experiences, not simply our politics. But really, is a novel political simply because the rugged, tough character is a battle-grizzled woman instead of a battle-grizzled man? If it is, what about that is so political? The fact that women can be tough? It makes me wonder if those people have ever thought for a second about the hell that is childbirth and the fact that most women are just better than most men at enduring pain because that's something they're likely to experience in their lives, at least according to the medical research I've seen, and I could be wrong about that.
So I do want to jump over to a question that, as we were leading up to recording, came up as a potential point of discussion. I think it is worth talking about how has political writing changed through the years. And with a lot of panels, I would be hesitant to ask something like this, but it's clear that the folks here are knowledgeable about the history of writing and the history of political writing that I at least want to explore, because I recognize that not everyone in the audience may have that knowledge. So I'd like for the two of you to share your opinions on that, or three of you, yes.
Yeah, sure. So I think that as time changes, authors tend to write about different topics, right? So if you look at, for example, the books during the Second World War, right, or immediately after, a lot of that was about the threat of mutually assured destruction or the power of military, right? We have propaganda about totalitarianism, right? Those were the greatest concerns of the era, right? So that's what got written. And as time moved by, we have, for example, different types of governments. Towards the 80s, you have a lot of for example, books that are pointing more towards socialism or towards analyzing different types of governments and the impact they may have on the people, right? Ursula Le Guin has a lot of writing between the 60s and the 80s that it's worth checking out in terms of political commentary. For example, The Dispossessed. I could not mention that one. It has an interesting twist towards the end. So if you have the patience for it, you will see it. And I think that over time, that also changed towards more of an individual commentary, right? So we moved from big books about like the society as a whole towards books about individuals, right? And to make that commentary not just one single big theme towards in the entire book, but more about smaller things that comprise a whole, right? So that depends. And I think that a nice way of seeing the evolution of the commentary is looking for books that are often classified as social sci-fi, which is a subgenre that ends up commenting on a society as a whole rather than on individuals, right? It doesn't tend to fit what people nowadays call or define as character-driven because it focuses more on society. And a recommendation that I would have in that regard is Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart by Stephen Erickson. The same author of Malasan, it's not Malasan in the space. It's very different, but it's a great book about that. And I think that as we move forward, that type of commentary will also change towards the thing that interests us, right? For example, you have comics, right? Graphic novels. They also have great commentary and they also are literature. I'm talking about, for example, V for Vendetta or Watchmen. Excellent, both of them, right? So when Watchmen is considered the greatest graphic novel ever written. So, and it's a lot about politics and what policemen does or doesn't and how that influences people's decisions, right? So to me, there is always a correlation of what's happening at a time and the concerns of that era compared to what the writers are actually complaining about, right? And of course, that's regional because, for example, if you check Russian sci-fi authors, they have very different concerns compared to American writers, right? And same with different regions in the world. And I think that's very rich to try to reach out for translated fiction as well and see what they are writing, right? At the end of the day, they also make commentary, and it's worth understanding.
So we're going to come at this from different angles because you're talking about literature, which I love, and I never heard of social sci-fi, so now I have a new subgenre to look into. So thank you, I really appreciate that. Um, but when I was teaching global history for 10th graders, we spent a lot of time on what's called the Enlightenment period. And we spent a lot of time talking about things like natural rights, separation of powers, capitalism, and later in the course, communism, philosophies, theories, all of these things. And while aspects of them have always existed as far back as the Roman Senate and then some more, a lot of this was an establishment of theories that would move on to make our government, like our modern governance. In other words, like, hey, we live in the consequences of those times, right? And when we think of political writing today, we think a little bit less to the governance of mechanics, although books like Elie Mystal's Allow Me to Retort a Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution certainly cover mechanics. We think more of the stories of those who haven't always been given fair treatment in history. And I think this is because we've expanded who is protected over the years, which is a good thing, and we should continue to do that. And I also think it's because there are people who are interested in clamping down on who's been protected over the years and removing protections from people, and that's a bad thing. And like the fight is more like who gets the protection now and why and how that gets managed versus the overall structure of we're going to have a three-part government where you have a judicial, legislative, and executive branch, because the judicial the branches we get now, we kind of understand how those powers balance, but we don't understand how those powers are applied to protecting the people when they are appropriately balanced. If that makes any sense, I don't know.
Yeah, I think there are some pretty big shifts that have happened throughout history, and I think a lot of it has to do with more voices being included. It's not just white upper class men writing about politics, and that's what it was for so much of history. Certainly around the turn of the century, we started to get more women, more people of color, and not that those voices didn't exist before then, of course. It's just that they weren't given an avenue to speak.
For our older viewers of the panel, the turn of the century that Ian is referring to is the turn between the 1900s and the 2000s. It is time to go take your ibuprofen for your back. As somebody who probably needs it for my ankle more than anything else. As we get ready to, and I want to ask a final question to you all. And I ask this as, everyone on this panel has some level of political writing in their stories, and I am all but certain that for as much as you may enjoy the work that you've written, you were probably also able to go back and be like, I know that I made these missteps before I got to the point where my writing is where I wanted it to be. So my question therein becomes, how can politics be handled or mishandled within a story? And what are some suggestions you would have, particularly to writers out there who are looking to be a little bit more political in their writing, as to how to effectively convey the messaging they are looking to convey?
I will say trust your readers. That's essential. I think that some authors try to hammer one point home one too many times, and that leads to, it becomes tiresome, right? Like you are reading and it's just like, oh, you already said that, right? And I think that sometimes when you trust the reader, you can make far more incisive comments, the type of comments that will become, like a little woodpecker, like I'm here and keep reminding you of what was there. When you hammer a point home too many times, it stops being like a reader may think that the writer considers them stupid, and that's not what you want. Because if somebody is picking up a book that has some commentary, they are not, so they are capable of understanding and engaging on what the author said, right? And sometimes without repetition, you can make more thorough comments. You can move through an argument rather than always hammering a small point home, right? And I will say that's the other thing. It's like, don't stay with the beginning of the argument, right? Whatever comment you want to make, there is a whole argument to it. Make it move alongside the plot of your book, right? So if you begin with, for example, to give you an example, in the Omens of War, one of the biggest tension is like whether two nations are going to go to war or not. It begins in the middle of an Nash equilibrium, right? Think of two nations like roughly the Cold War situation. They are both at the same level of weapons and everything. So the argument evolves saying like, well, we start at this point, there is a misunderstanding. How do we solve it? Do we negotiate, right? And the tension always remains. The tension is always the same. Why do nations go to war, right? But it moves from being simply a military argument to being a political one of how do we control the population so they have an opinion and that opinion validates what the strategists are going to do, right? So try to move your argument alongside your plot. I think that's always far richer than simply making one point and keeping it steady throughout the entire book, right? Because at the end of the day, even if you are commenting on identity, which is also a topic that I have in my book, nothing is fixed, everything is fluid, right? And if your stakes evolve, your themes should evolve as well.
Sorry, I'm over here trying not to sneeze. I love what you said about trusting your readers and making the argument move along with the plot, because there's a progression there, and as characters develop, I think it's important to note, like, as characters develop, they change their mind about some things. So starting off in an imperfect place doesn't mean that you're saying that the imperfect place is the right place to be, if I'm reading that correctly. For me, like, my answer is the leading contender for politics being handled correctly or mishandled is that when you're taking on a particular issue, you need to get informed enough to handle it carefully, or else you're uninformed enough to handle it poorly. If you're going to make a major plot point out of someone else's real life struggles, you either need to have a significant acquaintance with them on a personal level yourself, or you need to seek out the advice from someone else who does. This can take the form of a sensitivity reader if it's in depth and central, or just a counseling session or two if you're just brushing up against it. As long as you're well informed, you'll probably be all right for touching on most topics. But if you're going to be talking about a political issue as your overarching plot or theme, yeah, you're going to want someone with firsthand experience to take a look at it. And for an example, I have a short story out that I've submitted somewhere where it's about an artificially intelligent cyborg, think like a Terminator, and that Terminator is in the process of like being born, which is traumatic to that type of AI species, and they are making their decisions on what gender they're going to be. And I was like, I'm not really an expert on this. I know a little about this. I've thought about this for myself, but like, this isn't my bag. So I sent the story over to a friend of mine who I've known for a long time, knew them before they transitioned. And she was like, oh yeah, okay, here's what I think. I think you're pretty good. I think you've got mostly this. Here's one or two things you could tweak and you're good. And I was like, okay, awesome. Here's some money for you for your time. She was like, oh, you're paying me? I'm going to beta read this too now. And I got a free beta read out of it. Well, not free, but I got a beta read out of it, which was nice to have because now I've got deeper levels of feedback to go on. And I was like, okay, now I know that my story is on point and not going to completely miss what it's like to go through that experience, even though I know that this is an AI making the decision where it's much less personalized than it is for other people that are people and humans and have grown up with one particular frame of reference and gone to another one. That makes any sense. I hope it does.
I think it does. I also write about a lot about mental health. Like both of my protagonists in this book in particular, they have PTSD, and in the other one, in The Echoes of Yore, I'm using protagonists with dissociative PTSD. And I think it's very important to nail or to understand what the struggle is about in order to communicate it, because it's not about political correctness. It's more about if you are making commentary, right, you better make it right, right? At the end of the day, if otherwise it will be worthless if you are not actually making it correct or accurate, right? It may actually have even the opposite effect of what you want to achieve if you don't focus on, the accuracy and the lived experience. But at the same time, with those more individual topics, it is important to understand that every person experiences differently, right? So somebody may tell you like, this is not how I experience it. And somebody else will come back to you and tell like, this is exactly how I experience it, right? So there is also that nuance in there that we have to understand if we want to make that specific commentary. I think you had some good points in there, Jesse.
I think there is a risk of writing things that are too on the nose. What stories do really well is remove the reader from their current situation, their current politics, the specificity of it, in order to build empathetic understanding of the core condition. And so if you're writing something that's too on the nose, too clearly derived from especially present events, I think that it can pull the reader out of the story and you lose that kind of empathy that can be created. That's the magic of fiction. Um, and if I could just mention some books that I think did
Oh,
it
please.
incredibly well recently. Chain Gang All Stars, which I talked about in another panel, Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah's book that was a critique of the penal system. He wrote what was on the surface a very clear, um, you know, crucifixion of our penal system, especially in the US. But in all of the footnotes that are littered throughout the book, he drew back actual comparisons to what's happening in the US in a way that it was so clear as a reader that like the dystopia on the page was not the real dystopia. It was where we were living. Um, some other books that I've loved recently that I thought did it really well. Metal from Heaven, that's talking about capitalism, oil, destruction of the environment, and Blood Over Brighthaven, which I just finished, and I shouldn't have waited so long to read it. It's excellent. Um, yeah, and then there's a lot of authors in the indie space that are doing great work too.
You caused me to think of something that I didn't think of in the previous panel. That admittedly, or previous recording, excuse me, that I want to add in here, and hopefully this will make enough sense to be added. You brought up this idea of, you talked about changing all stars. The idea of, yes, there is this idea, this situation where very bad things are clearly happening in the story, but you look at them in a parallel to reality, and maybe the story isn't just a metaphor for reality, it's just reality with a slightly different coat of paint on it. And I think that that's an interesting way to look at it, because there is, going to misquote this. So I'm not going to attempt to directly quote it. But one of the scenes that sticks out to me as beautiful political writing is there is a scene at the end of the movie The Dictator with Sacha Baron Cohen. And I know that by default, that is going to get some eye rolls, but there is a scene at the end where his character is talking about, the appeals to dictatorship in America. And
Yeah.
when this released in, what was it, 2011, 2012, it seemed prescient then. And then you look at it now, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
you just get sad.
Yeah. That clip's been circulating a lot, especially in the past year. And every time I see it, I both like laugh, it's the laugh cry. It's
Yeah.
um there's so much happening in the US as we trend towards fascism and authoritarianism. that even 10 years ago we could make fun of. And now it's like it's really happening. It's
It used
here.
to be a very Aladdin situation that we were in, but now it's a very Aladdin situation that we're in.
Yeah, exactly.
Ian, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to take a moment to do a quick plug of anything that you have or that you would like to make those watching live aware of?
My novel Fruits of Our Labor is coming out this August. It imagines a near future America where women can give birth or can get pregnant asexually and don't need men. The patriarchy collapses. It's hyper political. And I wrote it in a fugue state while watching the 2024 presidential election happen. It's got a lot to say, and I hope people check it out.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me and thank you for the discussion. I found it very, very interesting. So you can find me everywhere on socials as Livia J. Elliot. And you can find my books on liviajelliot.com/my books. Right. If you're interested in my most political writing, The Omens of War is about a strategist. It's highly political. It's a bit complex as well because it's a genre blender and it has cosmic horror elements, psychological horror as well, and a bit of philosophy. The Genesis of Change is a bit more political philosophy, if you want to say it that way. And the Genesis of Change is free for my newsletter subscribers. If you want as well, I do teach writing craft and I share thematic analysis of books on booksanddan.com. I did a very in-depth analysis of the political situation in Dune. I also did economy in Dune and Blade Runner. So if you want to check it out, I have podcasts, I have essays, I write weekly in there. So you will get it straight into your email. So for my books and all of my writing, liviajelliot.com, and for the newsletter and all the analysis around the writing craft, booksanddan.com. So thank you, Morgan, for having me.
Of course, Jesse.
Well, I already plugged a lot of my stuff up front, so I'll just say Locker's Rebellion is my new novel. It's a story about queer liberation. You should definitely check it out. I'm available on social media. I focus on Blue Sky. I'm at jpohlmanwriting.com. My website is www.jpohlmanwriting.com, where I post some thoughts on literature and all this other stuff. You're free to check it out at your leisure or don't. I understand you're busy, you have time, and I hope I was able to help you learn something. Thank you all so much for having me. Morgan, thank you for moderating. Livia, great time. Ian, I'm sure you'll do great. Much love.
Again, my name is S. Morgan Burbank. I've been your moderator. Well, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists for joining us. If you are watching live, the next panel will likely start shortly. I'm not sure when this falls in the schedule. So if this is the literal last panel of the event, pretend I'm right. And if not, you can continue the discussion in the Discord if you're watching well after the event on YouTube. Stay tuned for, I assume, Mr. Beast. Okay, thanks.